Most people think Japan invaded Korea because it wanted Korea. That's not true. Korea was never the real target. It was simply the road leading to something much bigger. Something far more dangerous. Behind the invasion was a secret plan to conquer Ming China itself, a gamble so ambitious that it would leave entire cities in ruins and change Asian history forever. For a brief moment, it looked like the impossible might actually happen. Japanese armies swept across Korea with shocking speed. Kings fled, fortresses collapsed, panic spread across East Asia. But then the entire plan began to unravel, and the man who dreamed of conquering China would discover that ambition can destroy empires just as easily as it creates them. This is the forgotten story of Japan's greatest gamble.
For centuries, Japan had been trapped in chaos. Warlords fought warlords. Alliances formed and shattered. Entire provinces burned as rival clans struggled for power. Few men survived long enough to see victory. Yet somehow, one man emerged from that violence stronger than all the others. His name was Toyotomi Hideyoshi. By the late 16th century, he had done what many believed was impossible. He had unified most of Japan under a single authority. To the outside world, it looked like the end of a long nightmare. To Hideyoshi, it was only the beginning. Because peace created a new problem. Thousands of battle-hardened samurai suddenly had no war to fight. Generals who had spent their entire lives conquering enemies were now expected to sit still. And Hideyoshi himself had become accustomed to victory. Victory is dangerous when it becomes a habit. The more he won, the larger his ambitions became. Soon, ruling Japan no longer felt enough. He began speaking about China. Not trading with China. Not negotiating with China. Conquering it. Many of his closest advisors likely viewed the idea as fantasy. The Ming Empire was one of the largest and richest states on Earth. Its population dwarfed Japan's. Its resources seemed endless. Yet Hideyoshi became convinced that destiny was on his side. And there was another reason. He feared what might happen if Japan remained idle. Thousands of armed samurai without a war often create problems of their own. A foreign campaign could unite the country, reward loyal commanders, and direct military energy outward instead of inward. At least, that was the theory. There was only one obstacle. A very large obstacle. Korea. The Korean kingdom sat directly between Japan and Ming China. Any army hoping to reach the Chinese mainland would first have to pass through Korean territory. So Hideyoshi sent a demand. Allow Japanese armies to march through Korea on their way to China. From the Korean perspective, the request sounded absurd. Imagine allowing a massive foreign army to cross your country while claiming it had no intention of conquering you. The Korean court refused. Politely, firmly, and perhaps fatally. Because Hideyoshi interpreted the refusal as defiance. The decision was made. If Korea would not open the gate willingly, Japan would break it down. What nobody realized was that this was no ordinary invasion. This was the opening move in a plan to reshape all of East Asia. And soon, hundreds of thousands of lives would be caught in its path. But even then, the greatest danger had not yet arrived. In the spring of 1592, the sea between Japan and Korea filled with ships. Hundreds of them. carrying tens of thousands of samurai. For Korea, the attack came with terrifying speed. Japanese forces landed near Busan and immediately began pushing inland. Resistance collapsed faster than anyone expected. Fortresses fell. Defensive lines broke. Commanders struggled to understand what was happening. The Japanese army had spent generations fighting constant wars at home. Its soldiers were experienced, disciplined, and accustomed to brutal campaigning. The Korean military was simply not prepared for what was coming. Within days, panic spread. Within weeks, disaster followed. One city after another fell into Japanese hands. Military defeats turned into political chaos. Refugees flooded roads heading north. Rumors traveled even faster than the armies themselves. Some stories exaggerated the danger. Others underestimated it. The truth was frightening enough. The invasion was succeeding, far beyond anyone's expectations. Then came an even greater shock. The Korean king abandoned the capital and fled northward. For ordinary people, the sight was devastating. If the king was running, who could stop the invaders? Fear became contagious. Every retreat seemed to confirm that Japan could not be stopped. Every victory pushed Hideyoshi's dream closer to reality. And the speed of the advance astonished observers across the region. Japanese forces captured Seoul only weeks after landing. Soon afterward, they pushed farther north toward Pyongyang. The campaign looked unstoppable. For the first time, the road to China appeared open. Inside Japan, confidence surged. Inside Korea, despair spread. And inside the Ming court, officials began paying very close attention. Because a terrifying possibility was beginning to emerge. What if Korea actually collapsed? What if the Japanese army reached China's borders? Nobody knew the answer. Not yet. But events were moving faster than anyone could control. And the deeper the samurai marched into Korea, the more dangerous the situation became. Because victory was creating a problem no battlefield could solve. Supply. At first, nobody worried about it. Why would they? The campaign seemed to be working perfectly. Cities were falling. Enemy armies were retreating. Commanders reported success after success. But wars are rarely won by victories alone. Armies need food, weapons, horses, medicine, reinforcements, and all of those things had to cross the sea from Japan. The farther the samurai advanced, the longer those supply lines became. Every new conquest stretched the system further. Every captured city required soldiers to remain behind as occupation forces. The army was growing larger geographically while becoming weaker logistically. Hideyoshi still believed China would eventually submit. He imagined the Ming Empire collapsing under pressure, just as Korea seemed to be doing. But he was beginning to fight a different war than the one he had planned. A much larger war. A much longer war. And somewhere beyond the horizon, forces were already moving against him. Korean resistance had not disappeared. The Ming Empire had not accepted defeat. And a naval command of few people outside Korea had ever heard of, was preparing to change the course of the entire conflict. What happened next would transform Japan's greatest triumph into the beginning of its greatest crisis. The man threatening to destroy Japan's greatest dream wasn't a king. He wasn't a famous general. He wasn't even fighting on the same battlefield. He was at sea. And most Japanese commanders didn't realize how dangerous he was until it was too late. His name was Yi Sun-sin. While Japanese armies were celebrating victory after victory across Korea, he was studying something far more important than enemy soldiers. He was studying their lifeline. Every sack of rice, every shipment of weapons, every reinforcement crossing the sea from Japan. He understood a brutal truth about war. Armies don't die when they lose battles. They die when they stop eating. And so, instead of chasing glory on land, he focused on the supply routes connecting Japan to its invading forces. What happened next changed everything. One by one, Japanese transport fleets began disappearing. Supply ships were intercepted. Convoys were attacked. Cargoes intended for the front lines never arrived. At first, Japanese commanders treated these incidents as minor setbacks. Then the attacks continued, and continued, and continued. Suddenly, soldiers deep inside Korea began noticing shortages. Food became harder to obtain. Ammunition became harder to replace. Reinforcements arrived slower than expected. The deeper the army advanced, the worse the problem became. Victories that once seemed effortless now carried hidden costs. A captured city required supplies. A garrison required supplies. An advancing army required even more supplies. Yet the flow from Japan was becoming increasingly unreliable. For the first time since the invasion began, momentum started to slow. And momentum had been everything. The Japanese advance had succeeded because it never gave Korea time to recover. Now recovery was exactly what Korea was beginning to do. Local resistance groups emerged across the countryside. Former soldiers regrouped. Guerrilla fighters attacked isolated Japanese positions. Suddenly, the invaders faced threats from every direction. Ahead of them stood Korea. Behind them stood angry civilians. And between them stood an increasingly fragile supply network. The situation was becoming dangerous. But an even greater threat was approaching. Because news of the invasion had reached Beijing, and the Ming Empire was finally preparing to act. For months, Ming officials had watched events unfold with growing alarm. At first, some believed Korea might be able to handle the situation alone. Then Seoul fell. Then Pyongyang fell. Then Japanese forces pushed closer toward territories connected to China's sphere of influence. The warning signs were impossible to ignore. If Korea collapsed completely, the road to China could become exposed. The invasion was no longer Korea's problem. It was becoming China's problem. And that changed everything. The Ming court authorized military intervention. Large armies began moving toward Korea. For Japanese commanders, this was the nightmare scenario. The original plan assumed Korea would be defeated quickly. The original plan assumed China would hesitate. The original plan assumed victory would come before a major response could be organized. Now every one of those assumptions was being tested. Soon, Japanese soldiers who had spent months fighting retreating Korean forces found themselves facing fresh armies from the largest empire in East Asia. The war entered a new phase, and it was far uglier than anything before. Battles became larger. Casualties increased. Territory changed hands repeatedly. Neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough. The swift campaign that had shocked Asia was transforming into a grinding war of endurance. And endurance favored the Ming Empire. China could replace losses more easily. China possessed deeper resources. China could continue sending men and supplies into the conflict. Japan could not do so indefinitely. The very geography that had enabled the invasion was now becoming a trap. Every soldier in Korea depended on crossing the sea. Every weapon depended on crossing the sea. Every grain of rice depended on crossing the sea. And Yi Sun-sin was still out there, waiting, watching, striking. The dream of conquering China was beginning to look less like destiny and more like delusion. But Hideyoshi refused to accept that reality. He continued demanding victory. He continued issuing orders. He continued believing the next campaign would change everything. Instead, the war dragged on, year after year. And with every passing year, the costs grew larger. Thousands died, then tens of thousands. Entire regions were devastated. Cities were destroyed. Families were displaced. The conflict consumed lives on a scale few had imagined when the first ships left Japan. Yet despite all the bloodshed, neither side achieved the decisive victory it desperately needed. The war had become a monster feeding on everyone involved. Then suddenly, everything changed. Not because of a battle. Not because of a military genius. Not because of a surprise attack. Because of a death. In 1598, Toyotomi Hideyoshi died. The architect of the invasion was gone. The man whose ambition had launched the entire conflict no longer existed to sustain it. His death created an immediate crisis. The campaign had always revolved around one central figure. Without Hideyoshi, many Japanese leaders saw little reason to continue fighting. The risks were enormous. The rewards remained uncertain. And back in Japan, a dangerous struggle for political power was already beginning. The priority was no longer conquering China. The priority was securing the future of Japan itself. A decision was made. The invasion would end. Orders were sent. Troops began withdrawing from Korea. After years of warfare, Japan abandoned the campaign entirely. The dream was over. No conquest of China. No new empire stretching across East Asia. No legendary victory that would secure Hideyoshi's place as the ruler of a continental empire. Only withdrawal. Only exhaustion. Only loss. Yet the consequences did not disappear with the armies. Korea had suffered catastrophic destruction. Entire communities had been shattered. Economic and social damage would linger for generations. The Ming Empire had survived. But survival came at a heavy price. The enormous financial burden weakened a dynasty already facing growing internal problems. Some historians would later argue that the war accelerated the decline of Ming power, and Japan itself emerged transformed. The invasion had failed, but the lessons remained. Future Japanese leaders would remember both the possibilities and dangers of overseas expansion. The war became a warning, a reminder that military brilliance cannot overcome every obstacle, a reminder that ambition has limits, and perhaps most importantly, a reminder that some dreams are simply too large for reality. The most astonishing part of this story is not how it ended. It's why it started. Millions of people were pulled into catastrophe because one man believed he could conquer the greatest empire in Asia. Korea was never the destination. It was the bridge, the first step, the gateway to a dream that stretched all the way to Beijing. For a brief moment, that dream appeared terrifyingly close. Japanese armies crossed the sea. Cities fell. Kings fled. Asia watched in shock. And then reality struck back. Supply lines collapsed. Resistance grew. China entered the war. The impossible gamble unraveled piece by piece. What remains today is more than a forgotten conflict. It is a lesson written in blood. A lesson about power. A lesson about ambition. And a lesson about what happens when a ruler becomes convinced that victory has no limits. Because sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not across the battlefield. Sometimes it is the dream inside your own head.